Hi everyone. So chapter 15 discusses two different topics. One is the sensory pathway and the other one is the somatic part of the nervous system. So somatic motor here. So the autonomic nervous system is discussed in chapter 16 because that's a big topic, so they put it as a separate chapter. Initially we talk about the sensory information. When we talk about the sensory information, there is two different terms to understand. One is the receptor and the other one is the pathway. So the receptors are the dendrites and they are located in different parts of the body, for example in the skin, or they can locate inside the different organs, and that receive sensory information either from outside, for example temperature and light touch, or it can be from inside, for example deep pressure and pain. So once the receptors are received, so these receptors are like receivers, they receive information, and these are dendrites. It goes to the cell body and then it goes through the axons to the central nervous system. So there is depends on the type of stimuli. You have two different pathways. One is the somatic sensory. The somatic sensory either goes to the primary sensory cortex, which is in the parietal lobe, and that or the postcentral gyra, same idea, and that is for conscious understanding of sensory stimuli. Or they can go to cerebellum, and this is for proprioception, which I will talk about it later. And this may not be conscious. Okay, there's two types of proprioception. So if it ends up in the cerebellum, it will not be conscious. The second one is the visceral sensory, and that is from the organs, and that ends up either in the brainstem or in the diencephalon. So in that case, again, this is subconscious. Most of the time you will not feel the visceral functions. Sometimes you feel it because there is a connection, indirect connection between visceral sensory system and also autonomic nervous system and the cortex of the brain. So the autonomic nervous system and the visceral sensory may have an indirect connection. So sometimes you can feel, for example, your heart rate is increased, you will feel it, or you can feel the movement of the bowel or your bladder, or if the lungs are expanding, you're taking deep breaths. So there's different sensations. Sometimes you can feel it, and your stomach is growling. So those are the things that you may feel it, and that is part of the visceral system. Another terminology that you can differentiate these two: one is sensation, the other one is perception. So sensation is when a stimulus stimulates receptors or dendrites, that information is sent to the central nervous system, and that's sensation. But that does not mean you will understand it, because if the sensory stimulus is very small, you will not understand it, or the information goes to the thalamus. Thalamus thinks, okay, this is not important, so you will not feel it. For example, you start a fan and the fan is running, and you may not notice the noise of the fan unless you actually pay attention to it. So that the thalamus is filtering that information. But perception is that when it gets the cortex of the brain, so you can actually understand and you can feel the sensation, and that's after thalamus. Most of the time, not always, most of the time passes through the thalamus. Sometimes you have the sensory stimuli. For example, there is sounds there, there's light information, there's light touches there, but you're sleeping, so that information is not going to the cortex of the brain, and you will not feel it. But once you are awake, then you can feel it. So anytime it gets to the cortex of the brain and you are awake, then you will understand and feel the sensation, and that's called the perception. So it's a little bit different. Adaptation is that if a sensory stimulus is continuous and painless, then the receptors adapt to it, and you will not feel anything. For example, right now, if you're sitting on a chair, then there is sensation still there. There is pressure there that you may not feel it. But if you sit there for a long period of time, or if it is somewhere that's really hard, then it is painful. At that time, you will feel it. So if it's a continuous stimulus, no pain, after a while, you adapt to it. To touching, for example, your hair. Initially you feel it, then you will not feel it. Okay, that's adaptation. But if this stimulus is not continuous, it comes and goes, and it's painful, like my lectures, then you may not adapt to that. So you will always feel that. Based on the adaptation, there's two types of receptors. One is tonic and the other one is phasic. So tonic is always active, it does not adapt, and usually there are higher, some of the pressure receptors are there, and also pain receptors are tonic. Phasics are usually not active, and when there is a change in the rate and frequency of the stimulus, then it becomes active, and then once it adapts to that change, then it becomes inactive. So why is this happening there? Why this adaptation is there? Because that way the brain can focus on a specific stimuli. You don't want your brain to continuously feel something that is not important. So this way your attention can change if there is a new type of sensation there. The classification of sensory receptors, we talked about this in chapter 12. I hope you remember it. There's three types. One is exteroceptors. Exteroceptors, examples, for example, temperature and light touch. That's a general sensation, or a special sensation. You can have it sense of vision and sense of hearing. Proprioceptors are the ones that are for movement. So there is receptors in the joints, there's receptors in the tendons, and also for the stretch of the muscles. So you have the muscle spindles. And the third one is interoceptors. Interoceptors are deeper in the body. So there is general receptors for interoceptors, and those are for deep pressure and pain. And for special senses, you have a sense of smell and sense of taste. So again, this goes back to chapter 12, so that information is there. Then there's a types of the receptors. So one of them is the nociceptor. So this is another one is the chemoreceptor. There is also thermoreceptor and the mechanoreceptor. So there's four main types. So the first one is nociceptor, or pain receptors. These are free nerve endings, and they have a large receptor field. So what this receptor field means means that an area of the body that is supplied by one nerve fiber. If that area is really big, it means it's not very sensitive. If it is small, it means it's more sensitive, or you can feel the sensation very localized. If this large area, you may not feel it localized. So where are these pain receptors? They are located in a different part of the body. It is located in the skin. So it wraps around different organs, easier to remember. And they are located in the joint capsule. They are located in the solid organ capsule. They are located in around the bones and the blood vessels. So different areas of the body. So if there is any kind of physical damage, any kind of mechanical damage, burn, things like that, or a chemical damage, or infection is there, so there is a tissue damage. So those chemicals that are released from the cells or from the infections, or from the immune cells that are coming to the area, then that will activate these free nerve endings, and then the persons feel the pain. So that's feeling the pain is actually an important body response, because that way you can pay attention to it and you can take care of the situation. So people who cannot feel pain, for example, diabetic patients, they can get infection, and then even their foot can be amputated because of that. So the pain sensation is not a good sensation, but it's actually making you aware of what is going on in the body. Then is the second one is that there's a two type of the nociceptors. There is one is called myelinated, and the other one is unmyelinated. So myelinated is type A, and this is the fast one. This is called fast pain or prickling pain. And this is, for example, if there's a needle or nail or a bullet or a knife or something very sharp, damages the body. So the information goes to the thalamus, and thalamus thinks is important, and that goes to the primary sensory cortex, and you become aware of it. So because this is an important sensation for survival, it is acute, it is fast, and you become aware of it right away. But the type C, these are unmyelinated, so they are slower. So these are the different types of pain, like for example, itching, aching, burning, tingling, different type of sensations that are there. So the body thinks, okay, this is not for survival, so the person can't survive. So that's why it does not transmit very fast, and that goes to reticular formation. From there, it goes to thalamus. If it is severe enough, then you can feel that pain. So otherwise, you may not feel anything. Thermoreceptors, this is very similar to the pain receptors. They're located in the dermis, so pain receptors are in the epidermis, and this is in the dermis. You can have it also in the skeletal muscle, in the liver, but especially in the hypothalamus. This is the main area that controls body temperature. So for example, if the body temperature increase, then that sympathetic nervous system decrease, so the metabolism decrease, the muscle activity, heart rate, all of these conditions decrease. There is also behavioral change that happens, that the person tries to take off extra clothes and turn on the AC or the fan. But if the temperature is low, so then you can have a sympathetic system increase, so you can have increased metabolism, and the person is shivering. You can have behavioral change, for example. The person will put extra clothes and also turning on the heater, closing the windows. So hypothalamus is really important for thermoregulation. The temperature sensation, the pathway is similar to the pain pathways, and that goes to the reticular formation and thalamus, and from there, if it is important, it goes to the primary sensory cortex. So in the clinical settings, usually they test the pain pathways, and if the pain pathway is okay, they don't test the temperature pathways, because it is the same. So only if there is a problem with the pain pathways, then they can check the temperature to see if there's a problem there. The third type of receptors, these are mechanoreceptors. On the mechanoreceptors, there is actually there's a change in the plasma membrane. So the physical change in the plasma membrane from pressure, and that will cause opening of the specific channels, and then the sodium enters the cell, and that activates the receptor. So these mechanoreceptors are again divided into different forms. So you can have the tactile receptor, you can have the baroreceptor, and you have the proprioceptors. There's different types. Depends on the sensation. You can have the receptors for fine touch and pressure. For example, touching your face with a cotton ball. So this is a very light touch. But in this type of receptors, they are very, very sensitive, and they give you information about the type of stimulus and also location. Compare that with a crude touch and pressure. These are not very sensitive, so it will give you a vague idea about the location of the stimulus, and also it will not provide a specific information about the type of the stimulus. So example of that is like a paper clip that one side is sharp and one side is dull. So if you touch the face, one side is dull, one side is sharp. This is the only thing that it can detect, but it cannot give you more information about that. The tactile receptors are divided into 6 different types. So here are the different types of that. One is the free nerve ending. So you can see this is the epidermis of the skin, and these are the ending of the nerves, and they are very superficial. So this is why they are very sensitive to touch and pressure, and they have a small receptor field. It means they are sensitive, and they can localize the stimulus very accurately, and they are tonic. So that means it's always active. So as long as the sensation is there, they are active. The hair root plexus, this is the hair follicle, and this area, and this is the the nerve plexus is wrapped around it. So this is phasic ones. If the hair is moving for any reason, then that become active, and then it become very inactive right away. For example, you touch your hair, at the time you're touching, you feel it, and then if you put your hand on top of your hair, you may not feel it after a few seconds. So it adapts very, very fast. But that way, for example, if a foreign body is on your skin, or if it is a insect is crawling on your skin, that way those hair plexuses are becoming active, and you become aware of it very, very fast. And once that object or the insect is not there, then you do not feel anything. So it's again related to survival. Then is the third one is a tactile disc or Merkel disc, and these are also located in the epidermis, similar to the free nerve endings. They are tonic, and they have a very small receptor field, and they are for fine touch and pressure. So this is very, very similar with the function, and with some of the other characteristics similar to the free nerve ending. The only difference is that these are specialized epithelial tissue, that they are connected with the nerve endings. So specialized epithelial tissue, these are the Merkel discs, and these are the tactile discs that are connected with nerves. So these are nerve endings. The dark area that you see, these are the nerve endings, but very, very similar with functions with free nerve endings. The fourth one is called the tactile corpuscle or Meissner corpuscle. Now this one is located in the papillary layer of dermis. So the size is around 1 millimeter in size, and these are the nerve endings. This is the dendrites, and here you can also see this in the papillary layer. This area that you see, this whole area that you see, this is the epidermis, and the reddish area that you see, this is the dermis. Because it is located superficially, this is again is important for fine touch and pressure, but it's a bigger one, and it's a little bit deeper than the other previous ones that I mentioned, it like a free nerve ending and the Merkel disc. So this is why it's also good for a low grade vibration. And this one similar to the hair plexus, this is phasic one, so it adapts very fast. The other one is called the Pacinian corpuscle or lamellated corpuscle. They are located very deep, so they are located in the lower part of the reticular layer of dermis, or they may be in the hypodermis. They are bigger, so this is a nerve ending, this is dendrite, and all these lines that you see, these are the collagen fibers, and these dots that you see, these are the fibroblasts. So these are the fibroblasts, and the lines that you see, these are the collagen fibers. Between you have the fluid in between. So they are phasic also, but they are important for high grade vibration, or deep, very deep pressure. So Phasic, again, similar to the Meissner corpuscles, but the location is a little bit different. Ruffini is located in the reticular layer of the dermis, and these are the collagen fibers and wrapped around by the nerve endings. So this is important for the deeper pressure and also for a stretch of the skin. So you can see that anywhere in the skin, but also important in the joints. So for the movement of the joints, Ruffinis are also providing some information for cerebellum. So one is for sensation, general sensation of pressure, the other one is for movement of the joints, and they are tonic. There's 3 of these receptors are tonic and 3 of these receptors are the phasic. Some of them are located in the epidermis, some of them are in the dermis, in the different layers of dermis, and one of them is located also in the hypodermis. Then is the other one is the second type of the mechanoreceptors. These are called the baroreceptors. As I told you before, there's 3 different types of mechanoreceptor. One is a tactile, the second is baro, and the third one is a proprioceptor. So baroreceptors are mostly located in the visceral organs. So in the skin is not that common. And these are in the smooth muscles of the one of the example here is the blood vessels, but you can also see that in the hollow organs, for example, in the intestine. You can also see it in the lungs. You can see it in the urinary bladder and the rectum. So these are, if there is any stretches of the tissue, then they are activated and send signal to the central nervous system. Proprioceptors are located in the muscle spindle. So if the muscle is stretched too much, they become active. In the Golgi tendon organs, if there are a lot of pressure on the tendon because of the muscle contraction, then they become active. Or they are also located around the joints. So when the joints are moving, then these receptors become active, and the information is sent to the cerebellum. Then is the 4th type of general sensory receptors are chemoreceptors, and this is water soluble or lipid soluble. The best example is for oxygen and carbon dioxide, and those receptors are located in the carotid body and also in aortic body, so in the carotid artery and aorta. But there are other receptors too. For example, there are sodium receptors that are located in the hypothalamus or in the kidneys. There are other receptors, for example, estrogen receptors that are located in the medulla. There's also different chemical receptors are located in the intestine and the stomach. So that sends information to the nervous system. The location of the sensory pathways are important. So there is different neurons located in different areas. So sensory pathway is ascending, if you remember it. So the first order neurons, we are talking about the cell bodies of these neurons. So the first one is located either in somewhere near the spinal cord or somewhere in near the brainstem. So they are located in the dorsal root ganglion. If you remember, dorsal root ganglion is located in the dorsal root of the spinal cord, and that is located in the intervertebral foramen. It's located in the cranial nerve ganglion. So these are some of the ganglions, like semilunar ganglion or geniculate nucleus or ganglion, and these are located ventral to the brainstem. Second order neurons are located inside the central nervous system. So these are interneurons. They are either in the spinal cord or they are located in the brainstem. The third order neurons are located in the thalamus. Okay, but the problem is that the connection between the first order and third order neuron, this usually cross over. So it means that it's crossing to the other side, and most of the time, not always. There is exceptions. For example, some of the pathways that goes to the cerebellum and does not cross. but those are the ones that later on go to thalamus. So with that exception, if you don't talk about that exception, other pathways, they cross and go to the other side. For example, if the sensation is coming from the right hand, then it goes to the left thalamus. So that's the idea. And from there, it goes to the primary sensory cortex, but they don't call the primary sensory cortex or postcentral gyrus as a fourth order neuron. They don't say that. So this is that diagram. If you guys remember it, this was chapter 13, and I say that I will come back to that, so I have to keep my promise. And this shows the different sensory pathways. So this is the anterior white column, and this is one of them is one tract is located here. This is called the spinothalamic. If you remember the naming, spino, starting from a spine, it goes to thalamus, so it means it's a sensory. So there is two of them. So one is in the anterior white column, the other one, this is the lateral white column. So the second one is located in the lateral white column, and that's why it's called the lateral spinothalamic tract. There is a spinocerebellar, which means from a spine it goes to cerebellum. There is actually 4 of these, but in your textbooks mention only 2 of them, so I just talk about 2 of them. One is the ventral or the anterior one, and the other one is the posterior or dorsal spinocerebellar tract. And this area that you see, this is this whole area. If you want to include the midline, so this whole area, this is the posterior column. And the posterior column is, or posterior white column, same idea. It has 2 tracts. One is fasciculus gracilis, and the other one is fasciculus cuneatus. So gracilis is located more medially, getting information from lower extremity, and cuneatus is located laterally, getting information from the upper extremity. So this diagram that you see, that is called homunculus, okay? So this is for the motor and also for sensory. So I will talk only about the sensory, because motor I will talk about that later, okay? I will come back to that later. So this is part of the cortex of the brain, and you can see different part of the cortex is responsible for processing sensory information from different parts of the body. So some area has a bigger part for the cortex than other areas. You can see the tongue, you can see the face and the hands. There's a lot of sensory receptors in these areas. So this is why a bigger part of the brain cortex is dedicated to those areas, very, very sensitive. But other parts of the body is not very sensitive, so it's a smaller area. The foot is also a little bit more sensitive, similar to the hand. May not be as sensitive as the hand, and a bigger area of the cortex is responsible for that. And also you can see the sensation of the genitalia located more medially. This is the cingulate gyrus. This is part of the limbic system, and the sensation is also located somewhere there. I will come back to the motor homunculus a little bit later and discuss it in a few minutes. So these are the different pathways, and these are important for the exam to know. One of them is called the spinothalamic pathway. The spinothalamic pathway, there's 2 different types. Depends, how the fibers move from one area to another area. One is called anterior spinothalamic tract. It means that it's located in the anterior white column. So this one is the function is crude touch and pressure. Crude touch and pressure. So this is the first order neuron. This is in dorsal root ganglion. It enters through the dorsal horn, and it synapses in the dorsal horn. Then it crosses the body. It crosses the body, as I mentioned before. It goes in the anterior white column, and this is why it's called anterior spinothalamic tract. It goes all the way. It passes through the brainstem, and it reaches the thalamus. From there, it goes to the cortex of the brain. So you see that the information that was coming from one side, it crossed, and the sensation is on the other side of the brain, so it's crossed the midline. Another one is called lateral spinothalamic tract. So that one is for pain and temperature. So again, the first order neuron is located in the dorsal root ganglion. The receptors can be anywhere in the body. For example, it can be on your big toe, so that far away. And then it enters the spinal cord through the dorsal horn. Its synapse is there. It crosses the midline, and now the tract is located in the lateral white column, on the lateral white column. From there, it goes up, it passes through the brainstem, it reaches the thalamus. From there, there is another neuron that goes to the cortex of the brain. So it has different function, and the pathway is a little bit different, but the whole thing together is called the Spinothalamic Pathway. Another pathway is called the posterior column pathway. This is for fine touch, pressure, vibration, and proprioception. Fine touch, pressure, vibration, proprioception. First order neuron is located in the dorsal root ganglion. It enters through the dorsal horn, but does not synapse there. The fiber goes to the dorsal column. From there, it goes to the brainstem, and there is a second order neuron is located in the medulla oblongata. This is the nucleus gracilis or nucleus cuneatus. Gracilis medial, cuneatus lateral. Synapses, it crossed the midline. Now it's a different pathway. That pathway is called medial lemniscus. And that goes to the nucleus in the thalamus, so the ventral nucleus of the thalamus, and from there it goes to the cortex of the brain. The third pathway is called the spinocerebellar, and that is receiving information from the skeletal muscle, from the tendons and joints. So those are the proprioceptors. This is important for movement of the joints and stretches of the muscles. As I said before, there are 4 different pathways, but let's talk about only 2 of them because the book is mentioning only the 2. This is the anterior spinocerebellar. The cell body, the first order neuron cell body is located in the dorsal root ganglion. It enters the posterior horn, and its synapses in a deeper part of the gray matter of the spinal cord. It crosses the midline. It goes through the anterior spinocerebellar tract. So this whole area is the lateral white column, but this is located more ventrally. So that goes to the brainstem, and from there it goes to cerebellum. This image is actually inaccurate, unfortunately, because this one crosses again, so it ends up on the same side. So this goes twice. It crosses the midline twice and ends up on the same side. So this is a little bit an error there. If you want to draw it yourself, that should go back to this side. And posterior spinocerebellar tract is coming from the same side, ending up on the same side. So this is the first order neuron, and the posterior root ganglion enters through the posterior horn. Synapse is there in the posterior horn, and it goes toward the brainstem in the lateral white column. It passes through brainstem and reaches the cortex of the cerebellum. So it will be always on the same side, but anterior spinocerebellar actually crosses twice. In other words, the sensation of the proprioceptors end up on the same side of the cerebellum, so it's easier way to remember. There's also visceral sensory pathways, but these are less sensation there in the organs. They're located in the thoracic organs and also abdominopelvic organs. Majority of the general somatic are also in the visceral sensory. The only one that is not there is the proprioceptor. So the other ones are the same, only the proprioceptors are not there. So it's easier way to remember that way. So different parts of the organs are supplied by different nerves. For the face, the organs in the face, for example, the inner side of the eye, for the nasal cavity, the mouth, the pharynx, larynx, trachea, esophagus, lungs, heart, organs, I mean the major blood vessels, they are receiving sensory information and sending it through these nerves. Okay, so the cranial nerve 5, 7, and 9, they are located mainly in the face and neck, and cranial nerve 10 is located in the neck and the thoracic area. So that ends up all of them to the solitary nucleus. This nucleus is located in the medulla oblongata, and then information from there it goes to the thalamus. The information from the abdomen, okay, and upper part of the pelvis. So below the diaphragm, abdomen, and upper part of the pelvis, it goes through the T1 to L2 of the spinal cord. If you guys remember the T1 to L2, these are the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system is actually motor, but it also carries some of the sensory information from the organs. And the information from lower part of the pelvis is carried by S2 and S4. S2 and S4 is actually for the parasympathetic nervous system, which is motor, but also ascending part of that is carrying visceral sensory information. Now is the motor. So the motor, there's two types. One is autonomic nervous system. This is under subconscious control. So this is the one that we will talk about it on chapter 16. But for now, we'll talk about the somatic nervous system, which is mostly under conscious control. So for that, this is the skeletal muscle that are supplied by the somatic nervous system. The cell bodies are located either in the upper part of the brain or in the lower part of the cranial, in the brainstem or in the spinal cord. So if it is located in a higher area, this is the first. This is the upper motor neuron, and I will show you later so where they are located. So they are located in the cortex of the brain, or it could be somewhere in the brainstem. And these lower motor neurons are located either in the anterior horn of the spinal cord or the cranial nerve nuclei. So once again, the upper motor neurons are located in the cortex of the brain or in somewhere in the nuclei of the brainstem, and the lower motor neurons are located in the anterior horn of the spinal cord and the cranial nerve nuclei. So let's talk about these ones. Where are these things located? So this is the cortex of the brain. The motor, and if you remember it, it's located in the frontal lobe, the primary motor and motor association areas. So there's the precentral gyrus and also the gyrus anterior to that. Once again, you see different part of the cortex has different areas for different parts of the body. So for the tongue, for the facial movements, for the hand movements, a big part of the cortex is involved in processing the motor activity of those areas. But for other parts of the body, these are simpler movements. For example, just flexion, extension, adduction, abduction. So it does not require a lot of complex thinking and complex movements. So this is why a smaller part of the cortex of the brain is responsible for the rest of the body. So anything that is finer movements, then it's a bigger part of the cortex of the brain is involved. And similarly, in the sensory area, if there is a lot of sensory receptors there, then a bigger part of the cortex of the brain is responsible for that information. So there is three different pathways there for the somatic motor. The first one is called corticospinal pathway, and this is coming from the pyramidal cells. This is located in the primary motor cortex, which is conscious. This is the precentral gyrus. These are the biggest cells in the biggest neuron cells in the body. and this is the upper motor neuron. So this is conscious. Anything that, for example, you want to write something, you want to walk, this is information is coming from this area. So in this image, if you look at it, there is this showing this tract. So there's actually three different tracts are under the corticospinal pathway. So the first one is the corticobulbar. So it means from cortex it goes to the somewhere in the brainstem, and that supplies motor activity to some muscles there. So this is the upper motor neuron. It comes here, and the cranial nerve nuclei are located here, somewhere in the brainstem. But if you see it, it is bilateral. It's bilateral. So what does it mean from the clinical aspects? It means that if there is a damage in the upper motor neuron, then you can see only a weakness of those muscles. You will not see a total paralysis because those muscles are supplied from both sides. If you see a lower motor neuron damage, for example, a cranial nerve damage, then it is a total paralysis. But if it is upper motor neuron, it is only weakness, which means paresis. So paresis means weakness. So which muscles are the corticobulbar tract responsible for the eye movements? So this is cranial nerve 3, 4, and 6. The jaw movements, cranial nerve 5. The face movements, or the facial expressions. So this is cranial nerve 7. And also muscles, some muscles of the neck, which is the cranial nerve 11. The pharynx, which is cranial nerve 9 and 10. So different nerves are involved with that. The second tract under the corticospinal tract is called anterior corticospinal tract. This is important for movement of the axial muscle for the torso, and also hip and shoulder girdle. So let's look at this. This is the cortex of the brain. The fibers comes down, and this is the brainstem. So it does not cross the brainstem. Okay, it goes all the way down to the spinal cord, and the same segment of the spinal cord, then it crosses. See, it crosses the midline. Then it synapses with a neuron. This is the lower motor neuron in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Then it leaves through the ventral root, goes to the skeletal muscle. So this is the upper motor neuron. This is the lower motor neuron, and it crossed the midline. So if somebody cannot move the right side, for example, the right hand or the right leg, it means what? The cortex on the left side of the brain was damaged. Lateral corticospinal tract this is for movement of the limbs. So again, it's coming from the cortex of the brain, so it's coming down in the brainstem, but now in the brainstem it crosses. This is called the causation. So it crosses and it goes to the lateral white column, compared with the anterior corticospinal tract that was in the anterior white column. So that goes again, it synapses with the lower motor neuron in the anterior horn, and then it leaves through the ventral root. So this is for the limbs. So example that I gave you before for the movement of the hand or leg, that is from the lateral corticospinal tract, or for the torso or the shoulder hip girdles, that will be on the opposite side if there is any movements problem. So then usually the opposite side of the cortex of the brain is involved with that pathological condition. The medial pathway, this is more subconscious, so this is important for the gross movement and also the muscle tone. So this is for the muscles of the neck, torso, and also proximal limb muscle, not distal. Distal is another pathway. So there is 3 different tracts under the medial pathway. The first one is the vestibulospinal tract, that is coming from the vestibulum. So this is cranial nerve 8, and it is important for posture, stability, and also for balance. So there is actually two different type of tracts are there. One is the lateral one. Lateral stays on the same side. You can see this blue one, and the medial one, which is bilateral. Medial one is usually bilateral. So this is important for the balance and stability. Tactile spinal tract is another tract under medial pathway that is coming from the tactum. Tactum has superior and inferior colliculi, so this is coming from mainly superior colliculi. It crosses the midline, and it is synapsing with a different cranial nerve nuclei, for example, cranial nerve 3, 4, and 6, and also cranial nerve 11. And this is important for visual reflex. So for example, when you move your head and also your eyes are also moving, so that way you can see things better, and the object can focus on top of your retina. So movement of the eyes and the heads are coordinated with each other. So this one actually crossed the midline. Reticulospinal tract, this is coming from the reticular formation. If you remember, reticular formation is in the brainstem. So this stays on the same side. It can come from the pons or from the medulla, and that is important for the movement, posture, and muscle tone. So this is usually inhibited by corticospinal tract, so it does not have a lot of function. But if there is a damage in the corticospinal tract, then the reticulospinal tract take over, and then it can cause different activities. But normally it has just increase or decrease voluntary movements that are coming from the upper part of the brain. The lateral corticospinal tract, lateral pathway is has only one tract, and this is rubrospinal tract. And the rubrospinal tract is coming from the red nucleus. If you remember, red nucleus is located in the midbrain, and the pathway crosses the midline, comes down, and it synapses in the anterior horn. So if you want to know where it goes in the lateral column, okay? So now from lower motor neuron, it leaves through the anterior root and goes to the muscle. So this is for the precise movement of the distal limbs, especially upper limbs, and also for the muscle tone. Okay, so this supplements the function of the lateral corticospinal tract. This is the hierarchy of the movements. So different part of the nervous system is involved in different types of movements. If the movements are basic, then you can use the spinal or cranial reflexes, which are rapid and involuntary. So that will help the brain to focus on other things. Once you do an activity multiple times, it changes and become a reflex, so you can do it fast and you can do it without thinking. For example, playing a musical instrument, playing some different, or doing some kind of athletic activity, or even simpler example, for example, walking or jogging and running and things like that. These are all reflexes. So once you learn it, you always have it. You don't have to think about it. So that way, the brain can think of the more complex activities. That's the reason these reflexes are. Also, reflexes are important for removing the body part from the negative stimuli, so that way it can protect the body. Another part is the cerebellum. So cerebellum is important for balance and for fine-tuning of the motor activities and removing any kind of errors in the movement. So it's getting information from the proprioceptors in the joints and the muscles and the tendons. Is getting information from the visual system, and also it's getting information from the vestibule. So for the balance and stability, you need all these three systems, but at least minimum you need 2 of the 3, so that the person can be active and can be stable, so it does not fall. Excuse me. Another one is the basal nuclei. So the basal nuclei is providing background information about the pattern of learned movements. So once an activity is done many times, then that goes to the memory in different parts of the brain, and one of the areas that have the memory of different movements is the basal nuclei. So the basal nuclei, when the signals are coming from the cortex, then it checks those signals and then okays or says, no, this is not the right signal. And the primary motor cortex is for conscious motor activity. So for all complicated activity, if you want to do something in the beginning or you haven't learned it, you have to think about each movement, and that's why you're using your primary motor cortex. And once you move it, that information is stored in the motor, somatic motor association area, so you don't have to think about it that much. So you leave the primary motor cortex for all new and complex movements. This is a simplified version of the motor pathways. So initially, this is the premotor cortex that contains the patterns of the movement, the map of the movements that sends signals to the basal nuclei. So the basal nuclei that receive information from premotor cortex is the caudate nucleus and putamen. I hope you remember it from chapter 14. And that process information, and then that information is sent to the globus pallidus. That's also part of the basal nuclei. Globus pallidus sends information to thalamus. Then thalamus sends back information back to the cortex of the brain. So then is at that time, the basal ganglia already decided which movements are okay, which movements are not okay. That information is sent to the cortex through the thalamus, and then the primary motor cortex decides what kind of movement should happen. So then it sends signal down through the spinal cord. It goes all the way to the anterior horn, and synapse is here. And this is the lower motor neuron that goes to the muscle, and that can cause contraction of the muscle. But you can also see here, these are sensory receptors here. This is for the muscle spindle. This is for Golgi tendon. And there should be another one here that's not shown here. That should be for the joint capsule. So these are sensory proprioceptive information that is ascending. It is going back through the posterior horn. This is the dorsal root ganglion. So this is posterior horn. Synapse is there, and it goes to the cerebellum. So that if it is conscious, it goes to the cortex of the, it goes to thalamus. From thalamus, it goes to the cortex of the brain, and then that gives a feedback about the movement, also motor response of any type of sensory stimuli that is happening. It will be there because the parietal lobe and the frontal lobes are continuously communicating with each other, and this is important. Both of them, the function of both of them are important for consciousness. So this is happening if you consciously feel something. For example, you are moving your fingers, you consciously feel that, and this is the information goes all the way to the parietal lobe. But not all information, all the movements that are coming from the joint is felt there. You don't need to feel every time you move or walk or something. You don't need to feel everything. So that information goes to the cerebellum there. And the cerebellum is taking care of the balance. So it's a little bit different. Some of them are conscious, some of them are subconscious. And this is it. This was the last slide for this lecture. Thank you.